Most people think China won the global economic game by being cheap labor, cheap products, cheap manufacturing, but here's the real mystery. If China's prices were simply cheap, then global competition should have adapted. Other countries should have automated, innovated, or shifted supply chains elsewhere, yet instead, entire industries collapsed, factories vanished, and nations that once dominated manufacturing became dependent on a single foreign supplier. Why did this happen? Because China wasn't just selling cheap goods. It was selling a strategy one designed to become so essential, so efficient, and so embedded into global supply chains that the world could not function without it. Low prices weren't the product. They were the Trojan horse. Before today's headlines about trade wars and geopolitical tension, there was a quiet revolution reshaping the global marketplace. It started decades ago, before smartphones, before fast shipping, before megaports and billion-dollar factories became the new normal. In the late 1970s, China was a struggling nation emerging from poverty. Factories were scarce, infrastructure weak, foreign investment non-existent, and yet within a single generation, China became the factory of the world. But the real twist is this: China didn't win by competing. It won by eliminating competition. And the way it happened is one of the most underestimated stories in modern economic history. To understand it, we have to go back to the beginning. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping launched what became known as reform and opening up. For the first time, China allowed foreign companies to operate inside its borders. Western companies got access to incredibly cheap labor, but China got something far more valuable: technology, blueprints, management, knowledge, and the secrets of how global supply chains worked. China wasn't outsourcing tasks, it was importing knowledge. By the 1990s, China made a critical discovery: if you lower prices far enough, you don't enter a market, you conquer it. Western companies were built on profit margins. China's system allowed factories to run on almost none. Land was subsidized. Electricity was subsidized. Loans were subsidized. Environmental rules were minimal, and if a factory lost money, the state often stepped in to keep it operating anyway. Competing with that wasn't just difficult, it was mathematically impossible. Once China set the price floor, industries started falling one by one. Toys, textiles, furniture, shoes, electronics products once proudly made in the US, Europe, or Japan suddenly faced a competitor offering prices 30%, 40%, even 70% lower. Consumers loved the savings. Companies panicked. Many didn't even try to compete. They outsourced to China just to survive. Between 2001, the year China joined the World Trade Organization, and 2010, the impact was staggering. The US lost 2.7 million manufacturing jobs. The UK lost a third of its factories. Japan's electronics sector, once the gold standard, hollowed out. Antis wasn't a normal market shift. It was a shockwave. When China entered an industry, prices didn't adjust. They collapsed. Competitors didn't struggle. They disappeared. And once they did, something even more important happened. China became the essential supplier. When you control the supply chain, you don't just win the game. You become the game. By the 2010s, this strategy had quietly turned into global leverage. The world realized something unsettling. It couldn't leave China now produced 90% of the world's antibiotics, 80% of its solar panels, 70% of its consumer electronics, 60% of its rare earth processing, and over half of global steel. If China slowed exports even slightly, entire industries worldwide would grind to a halt. Low prices weren't a gift, they were a dependency trap. The fallout was enormous. Entire towns across the US Midwest collapsed as factories shut down. Manufacturing hubs in Europe were hollowed out. Japan lost dominance in sectors it once pioneered. Other developing nations tried to copy China's model. Bangladesh, Mexico, India, Bhutan could match China's unmatched scale or its ability to run factories at near zero profit for strategic gain. Western countries transformed. They became designers, planners, marketers, and financiers. China became the builder, and while the world enjoyed cheap products, it paid a hidden cost. The loss of capability. When governments tried to fight back, most solutions failed. Tariffs slowed China's exports temporarily, but supply chains simply rerouted within China or moved assembly to nearby countries that still relied on Chinese components efforts. To diversify supply chains helped, but only on the surface. The raw materials, parts, and machinery still came from China. Attempts to rebuild domestic manufacturing faced a harsh reality. Once industrial ecosystems disappear, they can take decades to rebuild. You cannot undo 30 years of outsourcing with a few years of policy. The most surprising part is that the strategy is still expanding. China is applying the same low-price playbook to the next generation of industries: electric vehicles, batteries, solar energy, shipping, and industrial machinery. In electric vehicles, Chinese models are often 30 to 50% cheaper than Western equivalents in solar panels. China's prices are so low that US and European factories can't survive without subsidies in batteries. China controls over 75% of the global supply chain. Even in shipping, China builds the majority of the world's container ships and port cranes. The pattern is unmistakable. Enter an industry, drive prices down, expand production, force competitors out, dominate supply chains, and gain leverage over the world. Cheap has never been the strategy. It has always been the mechanism. The first takeaway is that low prices are not always a discount. They can be a geopolitical weapon. When a country can afford to operate at a loss for years, it can eliminate competitors who cannot. The second takeaway is that once supply chains move, they don't easily return. The skills disappear. The machinery disappears. The industrial knowledge disappears. Rebuilding it can take decades. The third takeaway is that the real battles of the future will be about dependencies. Whoever controls the supply chains for batteries, rare earths, solar energy, and semiconductors will control the shape of the global economy. And this leads to a warning. The biggest risk isn't that China makes everything cheaper. The biggest risk is that the world becomes so dependent on those low prices that it loses the capacity to produce anything else. Cheap built a global empire. Dependence keeps it in place. But the real question, though no one has fully answered yet, is this: what happens when cheap is no longer cheap? If you found this breakdown eye-opening, and you want more deep dives into global finance, power structures, and the hidden forces shaping the world economy, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon. There is much more to uncover, Andy. Want to miss what is coming next.